All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I will just take a second to get my screen shared. Okay. Can everyone see my screen okay? Yep. Okay. Awesome. Well, welcome again to the third presentation in the Rural Resiliency series on rural immigration and welcoming communities. As Katie mentioned, my name is Jayde Roche and I'm the Director of Rural Immigration with the Rural Development Network. And as I begin, I'd also like to respectfully acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Treaty 6 territory, home to the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Saulteaux. So today I'm going to speak to you about some of the factors that influence newcomer attraction and retention in rural communities and discuss some of the unique projects that RDN works on in partnership with rural communities to increase their welcoming capacity. But first, I'll start with a bit of an overview of Rural Development Network for those of you who might be unfamiliar with our work. So we originated in Alberta as the Alberta Rural Development Network and started as a partnership of Alberta's 21 public post-secondary institutions. We expanded to a national organization, rebranding as the Rural Development Network in 2020. So our approach is founded on supporting communities in their efforts to address social issues. We listen to hear and understand community needs, provide support by developing solutions with them, and each solution is tailored to reflect the uniqueness of the residents it aims to serve. We support communities by providing access to innovative tools and resources, providing expertise and capacity when needed, helping communities to access funding to seed projects, and supporting an advocacy to help amplify the rural voice. Some of our initiatives include affordable housing, immigration, homelessness, and health and wellness. And we really take a holistic approach to our work, especially in rural immigration. We know that we cannot work in silos, so we engage with other experts on our team, community leaders, and stakeholders to better understand the needs of newcomers in rural communities and how we can address gaps such as housing, transportation, and mental health. So to give you a bit of an overview of the rural immigration work, our team launched in 2019 as a response to new government programs that have been put in place to attract newcomers to small centers, such as the Rural Renewal and Rural Entrepreneurship streams in Alberta, as well as the Rural and Northern Immigration Pilot and Atlantic Immigration Program. In addition to these programs, we also tried to better understand the emerging needs that we were hearing from our community partners. So we know that rural communities don't have a settlement agency or might not have experience welcoming newcomers. So we wanted to take a proactive approach in the launch of this initiative to support communities in building their capacity to enable successful settlement and integration in rural areas. We also know that the research and information available on the experiences of newcomers in rural Canada is very limited, so we wanted to continue to prioritize this in our work as well. So through our rural immigration work, we engage with rural communities and immigrant communities to better understand their needs and challenges. We also focus on capacity building efforts with rural communities to support settlement and integration, wanting to avoid, creating ongoing dependencies and really building up their ability to support newcomers, and also coordinating efforts to create more welcoming communities. Some of our projects have included developing various training programs for service providers on topics such as anti-discrimination, rural settlement, and supporting multi-barrier clients. We also work with communities to identify needs and service gaps through our fee-for-service work. We've worked on projects as well, so focused on supporting immigrant entrepreneurs. One such project was with a small town in East Central Alberta of only about 40 people, in which we engaged with youth, community members, and newcomers about their vision to support local economic growth and entrepreneurship. Some of our other work has involved working with rural post-secondary institutions to support international student recruitment, and also engaging with communities on religious and spiritual diversity and inclusion. And so all of the work that we do is really across Canada. So we apply these learnings and share them with communities, from coast to coast. So now I'd like to get into some of the challenges that we know rural communities face when it comes to rural immigration, and then talk a little bit more about potential approaches to address some of these challenges. So we know that nearly 80% of immigrants choose to settle in Canada's largest cities. We also know that rural communities often have lower retention rates than urban centers. So oftentimes newcomers are not staying in rural communities for as long as they might be staying in urban centers. There's also often limited supports and resources in rural communities for newcomers. As I mentioned, they often don't have a settlement agency available. So this can create additional barriers and challenges to newcomer settlement and integration. We've also found through our work that many communities just might not know where to start or don't have the resources available to assess the needs in their community. Many of our partners have also expressed concerns when a newcomer arrives in the community. They might not be aware that they've arrived in the community or might experience difficulty promoting their services and opportunities. Limited funding is also a challenge for many rural communities to support newcomer support initiatives. And as well, we found that there's very limited availability of training and resources for service providers, employers, and community leaders on equity, diversity, and inclusion topics, rural settlement, anti-discrimination that are specifically developed with a rural lens so that they'll be locally relevant. So despite some of these challenges, there's many opportunities for newcomers to settle in rural communities, such as lower cost of living, employment opportunities, greater sense of community and safety. So when developing new projects with rural communities, we've really used our understanding of these challenges and opportunities to help inform our work. So also looking at the areas of interest that people cited to building rural resiliency, some of the different ones were immigration, social dimensions, health, economic, and others such as planning and policy. And these are all important factors to consider. Rural immigration helps us to address labor shortages in rural communities, support economic growth, enrich the diversity and vibrancy of our communities, and support community inclusion. As I mentioned, rural communities typically have lower retention rates, but this doesn't have to be the case. By understanding some of these attraction and retention factors, we can help support newcomers to stay and settle in the community long-term and promote rural communities as destinations of choice. So through our work and some of the research available, I wanted to talk to you today about some of these factors. So the first is language and settlement supports. As I mentioned, this can be a key barrier for newcomers, and it's important to consider what supports are available in your community. If there are none, consider certain opportunities to work with larger settlement agencies or community organizations in the region. Oftentimes, these groups now support hybrid service delivery, so it can help to fill some of the service gaps or look at building the capacity of local folks through training. Next is welcoming communities, and this also has to do with community attitudes towards newcomers. So it's important to work together with all actors to consider how the community can become more welcoming and consider, maybe a group or committee that might take on some of this work. Employment and educational opportunities is also another important factor. And as well, the presence of other newcomers. So we know that through our work, it's important for folks connecting with members of their own ethnocultural communities, those who may speak the same language, understand different cultural values, and provide support when needed. So we know that many times newcomers might first go to members of their own ethnocultural community, or maybe even members of a local church if they're working through challenges rather than going directly to a support organization. So because of this knowledge, it's important that communities are aware of the different leaders and ethnocultural communities in their region and work to engage meaningfully with these folks. And last is affordable housing and transportation. This can be a really challenging issue to tackle. And we know that it's so important that there's access to suitable and affordable housing in the community, and also considering transportation barriers, especially for newcomers, where it can be a barrier to purchase a private vehicle or get a Canadian driver's license. So because RDN works in these different areas, we're able to support communities in assessing their housing and transportation needs with a bit more of that immigration lens, sorry. All right, and so now to talk a little bit more about some of the work that we do and our projects. One of the first projects I want to talk to you today about is called In Our Hands. So this is a project in partnership with RDN, the BC Co-op Association, Alberta Co-op Association, and the Women's Economic Council. So this is a cooperative entrepreneurship program that aims to support newcomers to develop their business ideas. The program itself will facilitate cooperative training and mentorship to meet the employment needs and entrepreneurial aspirations of newcomers to Canada. And we're actually continuing to accept applications for this program. So if you know anybody who might be interested, please let us know. But really the aim of the program is to help support newcomers in both urban and rural settings with resources to better understand the cooperative space. And this program as well is available in multiple different languages, which is one of the approaches we're taking to address some of those needs. Next, I would like to talk to you about two projects RDN is working on to support communities with increasing their welcoming capacity. So both of these projects are funded by the Government of Alberta's Settlement Integration and Language Program. And although both of these projects are based in Alberta, the learnings and resources developed will be applicable to communities across Canada to apply. The first project that we're just wrapping up is the Community Capacity for Rural Newcomers project. This project aims to help build the capacity of service providers specifically in supporting newcomers and in order to help improve their welcoming capacity and contribute to successful attraction and retention. We've identified this need as well through conversations with rural service providers as well as newcomers. And the project involves developing and delivering training sessions to rural service providers on settlement needs that's developed with a rural lens, so it's locally relevant. And in addition to these training sessions, we're also working to launch a free toolkit resource that will be available to everyone. The second project is called READY, so it stands for Rural Employers Awareness of Diversity and Inclusion, done in partnership with Lethbridge Family Services and Assist Community Services. So this one has just begun to support rural employers in building their organizational capacity to support immigrant and refugee workers. So through this project, we'll work with employers across central and southern Alberta to identify and address organizational gaps, develop individual training, and publish a toolkit resource that can be accessed by employers across the province and country. The overall goal of this project is really to increase the rural employers' capacity to support workplace integration and create more welcoming spaces for newcomers. Within this project, we actually currently have an expression of interest out for employers interested in participating in this free training. So if you are a rural employer in rural Alberta, please reach out or visit our website or the rural immigration landing page. And so finally, in addition to the projects that we lead, we also are working to connect rural communities to resources and other programs to help support newcomers. So one example is this program, which is led by the Multicultural Health Brokers in Edmonton. So it is the Understanding the Mental Health of Newcomers in Ethnocultural Families project. So they provide free mental health programs for ethnocultural families and training opportunities for service providers. So this program is available for newcomers in Alberta. And so we work with them to help connect these programs and services to rural communities to help address gaps in their communities they may not be able to fill if they're not able to provide mental health services in this capacity for newcomers. And another key piece of this work is also educating other larger urban-based organizations about the experiences of rural newcomers in rural settings. So that way, when they're offering supports from a larger organization, they're better informed about the local needs of the community. So if you're interested in this project, feel free to reach out for more information. And so throughout this work, I think the biggest focus is the importance of collaboration between communities, service providers, and employers. There's a lot of different connections between these different aspects, and folks aren't able to work in isolation. So this collaboration can look like strengthening community relationships, developing cross-sectoral connections within your community or outside of your community, Looking for opportunities for knowledge sharing, we find that a lot of the challenges that rural communities might be facing in Alberta, or some of the unique solutions that they come up with, will be applicable to other regions across the country. This can also look like creating effective referral networks for newcomers, helping to support community tours or developing welcome kits with these different stakeholders, and hosting cultural and social events to better support welcoming newcomers into the community. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you again so much for being here, and I look forward to talking to some of you during the breakout sessions.
Great, thank you so much, Jade. I see that there's one, sorry, quick question in the chat. Is READY only for South and Central Rural, the READY project?
Yeah, so the focus with that is kind of central northern Alberta. If somebody's interested, feel free to connect with me and we can kind of chat about what your local needs are.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now I'd like to welcome our second presenter, Jill Bucklaschuk, who holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Manitoba and was a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada postdoctoral fellow at the University of Guelph. Currently, she is a community-based researcher specializing in collaborative community-engaged research on immigration and settlement in Manitoba. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you. I haven't done much of the screen sharing on Zoom, so I will get my presentation up here.
Yeah. Just know if you need help.
Does that look okay to everyone? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's perfect.
So thank you for that introduction, Katie, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this session. It represents an interest of mine, and so I'm joining from Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory and home of the Métis Nation. And thank you, Jade, for that presentation. That I hope that a lot of the things I'm going to say aren't going to be too redundant, because you did a fantastic job talking about rural immigration and some of the needs that communities have. So yeah, my presentation is based on now over a decade of different research projects that I've done here in Manitoba in communities like Brandon and a small town called Neepawa and Steinbach and Winnipeg. So it's not all rural research, but I do find most of my focus is on rural immigration, and I do find there's lessons to be drawn from experiences in places like Winnipeg and Brandon as well. And my work since about 2007 has been on the temporary foreign worker program here in Manitoba, and specifically in the hog processing industry. So I've examined the experiences of lower skilled temporary foreign workers who are working in the hog processing industry. And here in Manitoba, they have been able to apply to the provincial nominee program for over a decade and a half now, and then that gives them permanent residency and allows them to bring their families. So as you can imagine, in small towns, when this happens, it has a profound impact on rural areas. And it's from this work that I draw this presentation, but I've also done studies with other rural communities on settlement and integration as well. So I'll be drawing on a bit of that as well. And much of the focus of this presentation is going to be on communities' response to immigration and what can be done to become a welcoming community, and also what it means to be a welcoming community. So I've noticed in my work that there are sort of two different ways that immigration occurs in rural communities. And of course, there's variation in this, but this is what I've noticed, is that sometimes immigration can happen to a community. And by that, I mean that this is industry or employer driven. So a good example of that is temporary migration programs. In this, the community has very little choice in what immigration looks like. And it is something that happens to them, and then they need to respond to it. Or sometimes immigration is a community-based strategy to attract, settle, and retain newcomers. And this is done to increase populations. As we all know, rural populations often are decreasing, and to fill labor market needs. And in this case, local groups of stakeholders may come together to decide who to attract and how to settle them and how to retain. In this, often communities target specific demographics of immigrants that they want: ethnocultural characteristics, religious. One of the examples of this that I'm not too familiar with, but I know what's happening, the rural and northern immigration pilot. In rural or in southern Manitoba, there's Morden and Winkler and Steinbach that about 20 years ago undertook community initiatives to attract specific religious, linguistic, and ethnocultural families to the area, and they did so quite successfully. So immigration is really often the only means by which rural communities' population may grow, and it represents an opportunity for rural areas. So one of the communities that I've focused on, and to really hit home this point of how immigration represents opportunities often, is the community of Nipawa in Manitoba. And this is a small town in Western Manitoba. Prior to 2010, there wasn't even one immigrant coming to the community, so that's quite recent. In 2016, Nipawa's population was 4,600 people, which represented a 26.6% increase, which is astronomical for rural communities, especially a rural community that had been declining prior to that. And then between 2016 and 2021, that population increased 23.3% to 5,600 people. And the interesting part about that is that a third of people who live in Nipawa in 2016 identify themselves as immigrants, and the majority of those have arrived since 2011. So to say that rural immigration has an impact on communities is I think not quite hitting the point too hard. It transforms communities. A 26.6% increase is huge for a small town. As you can imagine, this has a lot of impacts on communities. And regardless of, so Nipawa is a town where immigration happened to the community. It was a large hog processing company that recruited temporary foreign workers and hired them to come live there and work there. And then they became permanent residents and then brought their family. So this is something that happened to Nipawa. The same sort of thing happened in Brandon as well. But regardless of how that immigration happens, the changes that come with immigration really are far-reaching with short and long-term challenges and opportunities. Some of the challenges that we've seen in these communities are housing shortages. Rural towns aren't often equipped with much affordable and adequate rental properties. Social services are stressed. Schools don't have enough capacity. Healthcare systems are overwhelmed. Settlement supports may not even exist. And then there's language barriers because there's no capacity to respond to newcomers in their language. Also, there are long-term impacts. They're not all these challenges. There's opportunities. Population growth often leads to economic development. With that comes increasingly diverse consumer options in small communities. The town of Nipawa is fascinating now. There's, I think, 2 different Asian grocery stores there, and this is something that we could not have fathomed ever would exist in that community over 10 years ago. So there's also increased transnational linkages forming in communities where it's between newcomers and their families back home, and then this can lead to more migration, which is starting to happen in Brandon and Nipawa as well. So large-scale immigration to a community does have these profound shifts in the demographic, cultural, and linguistic makeups. And these communities are going from fairly homogenous to quite diverse in a short period of time. And there are definitely growing pains that happen. There's instances of discrimination and racism, and communities aren't, we can't always assume that they're automatically welcoming, and it takes work to become a welcoming community. So how a community responds to immigration really determines the success of whether people stay or leave. And I would assume that many communities' goal is for newcomers to stay. So with that, I will shift to this idea of welcoming communities. And this is one way that the community can become, or can have a more positive experience with immigration. So this is just a, I find a very helpful definition of welcoming communities. It highlights that a community needs a strong desire to receive newcomers and to create an environment where they feel at home, and to ensure that the newcomers are able to participate fully in community life, and ensure that newcomers have access to a full range of services and programs that they need. And if anyone wants more information on this, I have a list of resources at the end of the presentation, a link to this document. And there's also in the literature several other characteristics of a welcoming community that are helpful in thinking through this concept. So why do we focus on the concept of welcoming communities? Well, sorry, rural communities really must work to attract and retain newcomers, since they aren't traditional immigrant destinations, and there's just not the same opportunities that exist in larger centers. There's lack of social networks, there's fewer resources, there's fewer employment options. So it's something communities do need to work at this. And I find that the concept of welcoming communities is really helpful to hit home this point that's stated in the literature over and over, that settlement and integration are two-way processes. Settlement and integration isn't just about individual immigrants having to adapt to their new society. It's also about the host society and the host community needing to adjust to the needs of newcomers. This is a very important part of those two concepts. Focusing on welcoming communities also helps rural areas manage the challenges and build on opportunities, and making sure that newcomers have access to supports that they require. Also, immigration can lead to community economic development, and making sure that people stay will contribute to that as well. So how can communities become welcoming? How can communities respond to rural immigration, and what can be done to ensure that this experience is positive for both the community and newcomers? And communities must want or must ask if they want their experience to be positive, and whether they want to put the work in to ensure that newcomers are welcomed. In my work with the temporary foreign worker program, we've seen some communities that this is about a decade ago now, but they initially, when immigration was happening to their community, they were saying they didn't really want to plan for it because they were temporary foreign workers and they were just there to address the labor need and then leave. But that did not happen in Manitoba. So sometimes it's challenging to plan around this concept of temporary, but many people, when they have the opportunity, will choose to stay. So some of the things that I've seen to be quite helpful is to devise local strategies that are receptive to immigration, and also the last point, local strategies for immigrant attraction, settlement, and retention. And the word local is important because I don't necessarily think that there's a one-size-fits-all approach, because there are particular place-based characteristics that can impact settlement and integration and retention. And communities need to be aware of those barriers and challenges that newcomers may experience in their particular community. Also, and Jayde mentioned this a lot in her work, this multi-sectoral engagement and dialogue is essential. Involving industry, government, social services, community-based organizations in a back and forth dialogue cannot be underestimated. In some communities, we've seen organizations try to work in silos and it doesn't work. Success comes from sharing information back and forth, and also to be proactive in planning and information sharing, which is related to this multi-sectoral engagement. And just, sorry, on my last slide here, these are some examples of initiatives to build a welcoming community that I've been involved in. In Brandon, in 2007, we started when the temporary foreign worker program was really taking off, and Maple Leaf Foods was hiring hundreds of workers there. We recognized that people were working in silos and weren't really speaking to one another effectively. So we brought together community dialogue groups of multiple stakeholders across, every sector imaginable. We had industry at the table, we had the city government, we had provincial government, federal government, schools, a healthcare system, everyone we could think of. We brought them all together to share information, and just, in a round table in a university. And this was quite successful. And one of the examples was that schools could learn from industry about their anticipated hirings, and then they could plan for enrollment. And so this, because employers had information and data on family sizes, and they could share that with schools. So those sorts of things are quite helpful. And I'm sure most of you have heard about local immigration partnerships. And they were designed in 2018 and funded through IRCC with the intention of building welcoming communities. So the purpose of LIPS is to bring together stakeholders and to collaborate and coordinate on local initiatives, and for welcoming and settling and integrating newcomers. And the fantastic thing about LIPS is that they're not a direct service provider, but they work sort of one step above that to coordinate local initiatives that, that are separate from service provision. And they can really be tailored for the particular region and community that they're in. They're a ton of work to get started, but I've seen them work quite well in rural Manitoba in helping, this is part of that, educating the community. So it's really focused on celebrating the diversity and the opportunities that exist through immigration. So with that, I'm looking forward to the rest of the presentations. And yeah, that was, I could say a lot more, but that is all I will say on that. So thank you. And there's just some resources, and if you need more information, please contact me. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Jill. We will also share the resources from your slide to participants later, so they can look for that in their email afterwards. Great, okay, so now I'm going to welcome our third speaker, Deena Fuller. So Deena is the Executive Director at Hinton Adult Learning Society, where she has worked for 13 years. She has worked on projects to help new immigrants integrate into the community, including ELL training and supports for Syrian refugees, Welcome to Hinton, Rural Immigration and Community Inclusivity Project, and Welcoming Communities. Welcome, Deena.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. As Katie said, I'm here from Hinton. We're on Treaty 6 territory, and I'm just going to share my screen here. There we go. Excellent. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Hinton and what we see as a small rural community with immigration here. So what we've been doing, we're known also as Hinton Employment and Learning Place, and we're a community-based organization that provide a lot of different programs and support services for our community. So we offer the Community Adult Learning Program, FAS and PCAP programs, workplace training, employment services for persons with disabilities. We work a lot with homelessness, and that's along with the RDN as well, and GED test prep and testing. Our vision is to lead and inspire the Hinton community to be safe, accepting, and inclusive. And our mission is to empower and advocate for community members to learn and grow in a supportive environment. We work to reduce barriers to create an inclusive community where everyone feels safe, valued, and involved. So specifically for newcomers in Hinton, we do a few different things. We offer workshops such as English as a second language. And along with that, we offer support services such as CELPIP and IELTS test prep. We do mostly multi-level ESL classes because we find being in such a small community, we don't have enough students to offer beginner, intermediate, and advanced classes. So we try and have one class where we cater to all of the different levels, which isn't always easy, but we do the best we can. CELPIP and IELTS test prep. CELPIP and IELTS are tests that are required for Canadian citizenship and permanent residency. We also offer one-on-one ESL tutoring. We work a lot with our immigrants here with applications, citizen applications, permanent residency applications. I find all of those things are so hard to do as someone who speaks English. I can't imagine trying to do that on my own if I did not have a good understanding of the English language. We also help with immigrants finding work. So we offer help with their resumes, their cover letters, their job search, all of those kind of work-related activities, and integration into the community. So a lot of the time people will come here with their children. They don't know what the schools are, what the recreational activities are, different places that they can go for help. So we try and refer them to different organizations and even take them by the hand and bring them to the places where they need to go. Yeah. So we've been supporting newcomers through our English language learners program since 1984, but it's only been in about the last 15 years we've started providing the additional supports just due to there's so many gaps in services for our newcomers. So we wanted to become a place where people can come to and we can be able to take them and teach them about our community. And with the temporary foreign worker program, we've seen more newcomers coming into our community who required additional help. And we find that if they're coming in, because what we're known the most for would be for the English language learning classes, there's so many different things that they require, and that's kind of how we found about their additional needs. And last year, we worked with the RDN to better understand our immigrants in Hinton and the needs of our immigrants. And we worked together to find out what the service organizations in Hinton thought immigrants needed and what immigrants felt they needed in our community and how we could go about addressing those needs. And so we found that the majority of immigrants were admitted through the economic categories. So as a temporary foreign worker or coming over to work in some way, 50% were secondary applicants, which were spouses or partners. And people who came through sponsorship of a family member made up almost 14% of the recent immigrant population. And it's interesting that none of the immigrants were refugees between 2011 and 2016. However, in 2018, we've seen quite a few Syrian refugees come to our community through sponsorship through mostly the churches. And so we were able to receive a grant from Advanced Education to provide English language learning and support services specifically for this group for a 2-year period. And it was wonderful. We learned so much about them. We were able to help them integrate into the community better. Now, unfortunately, all of those people have moved out of our community. Some moved to Montreal to be with families, some moved closer to Edmonton, and which is really a challenge in a small community is keeping people here because there's so many more support services if they can move to a bigger center. So this is kind of what we found with our work with the RDN. The population of immigrants in Hinton is about 10%. That was in 2016. It's probably, I would guess it hasn't changed too much. The largest number of immigrants call the Philippines home, followed by Jamaica, which is interesting because about in 2016, one of our biggest employers, Tech Coal, recruited a bunch of heavy duty mechanics from Jamaica to come over. So I'm guessing why that number is probably high. United Kingdom, India, and South Africa. Right now, we have a lot of immigrants from India in Hinton, so that number may go up a little bit. And we have a few programs and services specific to immigrants or newcomers here in Hinton. We have our organization who helps. So we also have the Hello Hinton program, which is offered through FCSS. The barriers that immigrants seen in our community, they notice that there's a lack of availability for some services. So there's no translation services here. We're lucky if we can find somebody, or if we can use Google, I guess. But there's really no translation services here. Legal services specific to immigrants, there's nothing like that here. And activity-oriented courses such as cooking classes and art classes, which we do here through our organization. In some parts, we had one of our ladies that was taking English language courses from India, and she has been providing cooking classes out of our community kitchen here, which has been great. So there's a few things like that, and maybe welcome packages, transportation. Hinton is a very spread out community, and we have a transit, but it only runs until 8 o'clock at night. So if you need transportation after that for work, it could be quite expensive to get a taxi, or it could be quite a far walk for people. Affordable housing also is always an issue. Peer support, tea time conversation group, and extended service hours. So a lot of people are working during the day, and then any supports that they need at night, there's nothing available. And we also interviewed the different community organizations in Hinton to find out what they thought some of the gaps were, or what the needs of immigrants were. And they found that they thought food security may be a problem, basic settlement support, pre-arrival support, transportation, lawyers and legal work, and access to technology. So there are some similarities before what the service providers thought and what the immigrants thought as well. They also consider lack of networks such as family and friends, difficulty maintaining their culture, and a high cost of living that influenced their decision to move out of Hinton. Some challenges that organizations have, we always have a challenge with funding, of course. That seems to be common across any programs with immigration. Discrimination and racism, it does happen in small communities. Lack of resources, immigration specialists, travel to larger centers is very costly. So even if somebody has to travel to write their SALPIP test or their IELTS test, they have to go to Edmonton. I've even had a couple of clients who have had to go to Vancouver to write their test because the places in Edmonton were booked up. So that can be very costly. Isolation, this is a very big concern for newcomers coming to small rural communities. They're afraid to or hesitant to go out into the community, whether they don't speak the language or whether they're dressing differently and people are acting differently towards them. So sometimes that's a challenge. And it's also hard and expensive to bring their family members to Canada. I think some of the things that we discovered that we can do to make our community more welcoming towards immigrants and to help our immigrants more is to always keep collecting the data and try to find out how we can better support and definitely increase awareness on racism and discrimination incidents. So more training for employers and anti-discrimination training, employment supports, effective service delivery, offer services with extended hours, become an inclusive community, doing more community events that are geared towards newcomers, and infrastructure investment, accessible housing, accessible and affordable transportation options, and address the current needs. So that's kind of what we are seeing in Hinton. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Great, thank you so much, Deena. Okay, we have some time now for a bit of a question and answer period. I'll take a minute to say something that I kind of noticed across the presentations, and then if folks have a question, feel free to pop it into the chat, or you can unmute yourself. One of the things I thought was really interesting kind of across your presentations was really thinking about the cause that brings people to Canada. So thinking about if it's for employment or because folks are leaving their home because it's unsafe or insecure, and what that means in a community. So has the community intentionally recruited folks? Is it an employment piece, and how that impacts relationships? And the importance, it struck me the importance in each of your presentations between both formal and informal support. So thinking about how it gets formalized through organizations, but also the kind of community networking building that sounds like it's really important, of course, to folks as it is to all of us. And how to think about building space for that in our communities is really important. You know, I also loved your comment about someone who's attending your programs providing programming at Hinton Helps, because it strikes me that there's a, you know, as we're thinking about immigration, there's a real focus on service provision for people instead of thinking about sort of strength-based and what people are bringing into communities and highlighting that. And that's one of the avenues to build those kinds of informal connections and welcoming pieces. I see a comment in the chat here about welcome wagons. I don't know if the three of you can comment on that, if you've seen it happening in communities or something like that, that kind of more informal kind of community neighborhood level practice.
I'm sorry, what was that? I just missed the
Sorry, like a welcome wagon. So I guess I can speak in my experience. In my small town where I grew up, it would be like the folks would show up with a basket of things and, you know, invite people to dinner, or usually casserole. I'm from the East Coast, so like potatoes always. So that kind of informal welcoming. I don't know if that's something you've sort of seen in your work or community.
Yeah, so we used to have a welcome wagon here, where somebody would go with the basket of some different information about our community. And now it has moved to FCSS actually, and they do the Hello Hinton program. So basically, if a newcomer is, it's for anybody, it's not just for immigrants, but if anybody is moving into our community, they can get a package from FCSS, which includes all of the different service providers, the different schools, a bunch of information about our recreational activities. So there is definitely something like that available for people. I mean, one of the other things that we can think about as well is if you're coming from another country, the language is always a barrier. So to even making those brochures or those posters or anything where you're trying to connect with newcomers with a more clear language lens. So it's a lot easier for them to understand what's, so maybe they want to go out and do something, but they don't understand the poster, right? So if we're making it more able for them to understand, it's much better.
It's Cheryl here from St. Albert Further Education. I wonder if I could make a comment on Welcome Wagon.
Yeah, please, Cheryl.
Thank you. What we discovered is that Welcome Wagon Canada disbanded because they could no longer afford to operate during the pandemic. So although it's still available in the US, it's not available any longer in any Canadian communities. So people have to do, as Deena said, and do something locally if you're going to, you know, emulate that kind of situation. We were quite disappointed to lose ours in St. Albert, and then so did some investigation to find out why, and that's exactly why. The other thing that we have done, and Deena reminded me, is with our website, we have Google Translate, so people can choose the language. So it's an easy plug-in to most websites. And then people can keep in our whole website, everything turns into that language. It's quite magical. So that might be something that people would think of. I know I've been suggesting to others in town here that that would be so much easier for newcomers if they could see that information in their own language. Thank you. I appreciate you being.
Cheryl, that's great and really helpful information. I also see Patrick in the chat, who's from Lloydminster, has said that they're planning on implementing one next year. So thinking about it maybe as a model. Okay, Laura also has said, I wonder if the local realtor group might be of use. When I moved, our realtor was our first point of contact in a rural community. There wasn't much of a welcome center. He provided us with information about local programs and some resources. and did so as a part of his services. So what if that was something that was provided for realtors to give to new home buyers, or something similar for renters, which is interesting in rural communities, thinking about accessibility of rental housing too, which can be an issue. Someone has also commented that they did some research on retention in Brooks in 2007, and it's striking that retention issues haven't changed. I wonder if any of you want to kind of comment on that question of retention, and maybe what you've noticed might be kind of a protective factor against retention. So if you're talking to folks who have stayed and made a permanent home in rural communities, what has been kind of the clincher for them, so to speak, in terms of staying? Anyone, if you want to speak to that or have any thoughts? Jill? Yeah.
Well, my context is temporary foreign workers, and for them, particularly ones working in the hog processing industry, they are lower skilled, and so it's availability of jobs really affected them, but also you know, having sorry, ethnocultural like people from their own community there, I think really helped. But when I've spoken to people who have stayed, it's a lot of people liking this, just the lifestyle in smaller towns. A lot of people thought that in Neepawa and Brandon it was quite welcoming, and a lot of people that I spoke to had no intentions of leaving, especially if they had a family. So when they could bring their family with them, that really affected retention. If it was a single person who didn't have a family and was maybe in their late 20s or something, maybe they wanted to move to a bigger center. But if they had a community and of you know, a social network and had jobs, they were more likely to stay.
I would add to what Jill has shared. Like it is quite difficult to pinpoint maybe one push or pull factor for each community, which will always likely be different. I think one of the most important things for communities is just continuing those conversations and engaging with newcomers and immigrants in the region. In one of the communities that we worked with, we found that oftentimes, you know, the spouse was the primary applicant and then had a position secured in the region, but their partner didn't necessarily have a job or faced issues with foreign qualification recognition, language barriers, etc. And because of where the region was, there wasn't really any employment or job opportunities for them. So that was one of those, you know, push factors that this is going to influence our ability to stay in the community, because we do really like the community, but it's just not, you know, practical to be driving half an hour away for a minimum wage job in the winter, transportation issues. So what the community had done is help to facilitate conversations around, you know, how can we support the partners of folks and address some of the needs in our community. So what they found through that is that the individuals really wanted to start their own business. So then they looked at resources and supports that they could connect those individuals with to, you know, support their decision to stay or start a business within the community that they wanted to pursue.
That's great. Thanks, Jade, for that example. Marilyn, I see your hand is up. Did you want to add something or ask a question?
Yes, so I'm Marilyn and I'm Economic Development Officer in Neepawa. Good. Thank you, Jill, for recognizing the challenges and opportunities that have been here. So I just wanted to say that access to post-secondary locally is important for our newcomers. They have settled in Neepawa. They like the safety that they feel here, and to send their children off to a larger center can sometimes cause them a little bit of angst. So I would like to suggest that access to post-secondary, which Neepawa doesn't have figured out yet, but we're working on it, it is an important piece, as well as, Jade, as you said, the opportunity for entrepreneurship. They they're constantly in my office with the next big idea that will support their family. They're all about multiple lines of income for their households. So I see a lot of that opportunity for entrepreneurship, and it's a real touch point for my office to meet newcomers by offering those entrepreneurship supports.
That's great. Thanks, Marilyn. I love that kind of dual focus of wanting to support people, but also recognizing that responding to a need means that people will be more likely to come and be a better touch point. That's really great and thoughtful. Nicole, I see your hand.
Yes, are we still good morning? Yes, it's still morning for us here. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your presentations. I'm in Grand Prairie in Northwest Alberta, and I just wanted to share that I work with the provincial government in economic development, but in my free time, I am a family mediator. And I noticed that, Deena, you touched upon lawyers and legal paperwork often being an issue. And I just wanted to share that up in Grand Prairie, and I'm not sure how across province this is, but the city of Grand Prairie has started using a service called Help Seeker. It's like an app where people can find social services through Help Seeker. And I just wanted to share how valuable that can be. So for example, myself as a family mediator, I have employed a sliding scale for affordability, and therefore, and working with Odyssey House, which is our women's shelter, in order to provide services to particularly women, but facing legal or needing legal help or support. And then I've put myself on Help Seeker, and I'm getting quite a bit of feedback from that. And it's just wanted to share that maybe that was something that could work for others as well.
Thanks so much, Nicole. That's great. I love how many resources we're getting here. I was really struck when I initially met with Deena about how much is happening, you know, not necessarily off the side of the desk, but in response to things that are emergent. And it sounds like so many of your communities are doing the same thing. And that's both, you know, great because we can be responsive and pivot, but it's also really difficult if you're doing stuff, as we heard in Jane's presentation too, without resources or funding or long-term support. Great. Okay, so I think what we'll do now is move into our breakout rooms. So we have some specific questions that Kara's putting in the chat here, and you'll be able to share the breakout room that's the most interesting to you. So the first question is around strengthening capacity to support newcomers. The second is around sort of recognizing where in your community is especially welcoming for folks right now and how that could be applied elsewhere in your community. The third questions are about sort of what you've learned today or heard that you might bring back to your community and what it might look like specifically in your community, which is probably different from other people's community. Those breakout rooms should pop up. If you don't see them, you can click breakout rooms and then select which one. And then we'll come back all together in about 15 minutes, and I'll ask groups to share with. Okay, great. I hope your sessions or your breakout rooms were filled with discussion and learning. Does anyone want to share a few things that came up for you in your rooms?
I could share from room 2. I was madly making notes while we had a really lively and very informative conversation on supporting newcomers. So if I was to summarize some of the common themes, was that there's a very serious lack of continuous funding for newcomer programs. So welcoming people to the community and making sure that they're aware of all of the resources that are otherwise available to them isn't something that is easily funded. So there's many hardworking people in our breakout group that were talking about how they were taking on projects on the side of their desk and trying to find some creative funding resources. And basically that we were finding that there wasn't enough upward mobility. So people who would come from other communities or other countries would come with amazing skills, but they would be trapped in low-end service jobs that they were hoping to, graduate out of. And if they aren't able to do that, then they leave. So that kind of creates this cycle of coming and going that we're trying to work against, and have people live fulfilling lives that have upward growth. Of course, I was thinking about EDI as soon as I hear about equity, diversity, inclusion, extra perking up, but ultimately there needs to be more language support, and that's very challenging in small communities. And there needs to be even an equal opportunity for welcoming people of all countries. So right now there's a lot of focus on people in the Ukraine coming as refugees, but making sure that people recognize that people from all countries need an equal treatment and an equal welcome.
Great, thanks, Laura. That was very thorough. Does anyone else want to share from the other room what came up, some points of discussion?
January room 1, we echo a similar theme, a lot of work to be done, very difficult to be able to get stable funding. Certainly long-term is on a wish list. Each person is doing what they can according to the available resources. That it is very important that all individuals be able to have access to services, no matter what nationality or group that they come from. And also that I, as a dual national, through the organisation, are not-for-profit, work with Australians across Canada who are experiencing similar problems to Ukrainian groups, and that is highly mobile rural living. Try to be able to develop relationships. Those relationships are not as easily sustained because people are moving away in search of work and stability and better resources. That being said, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for such an incredible initiative, well needed, and thank you again.
Thanks so much, Jen. Great. Well, we're almost out of time, so I just want to extend another thank you to our presenters today for sharing your time and experiences with us. It's really appreciated. We will send an email out to all attendees with a link to the recording. Again, if you missed anything or want to share with anyone, as well as resources that were shared today. And I want to remind you that we have one more session coming up, which is the same time and place, Zoom, next week on the digital divide. And so in that session, we'll be thinking about the different aspects of internet access for rural and remote communities. And we would love to see you there. Thank you so much for attending today, and we hope to see you next week.